Okay. You ready to go, Kim?
Yeah.
All right. I'm Vincent. Probably everyone here knows me and saw me here last week and the week before. This week I wanted to share a technique that I've been using in my practice for the last maybe 10 years now. And this has to do with touch designer and texture caching. Last month I spent some time in Bali doing a residency with a program called 3DNight, which is the Digital Naturalism Conference. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do there. It's kind of a lot of biologists and digital artists and creative coders and people working with their hands and with natural dyes and inks and plastics and these sorts of things. And I'm a little bit more on the digital side than on the naturalism side, and I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do while I was there. But I ended up employing a technique that I use with my time lapse a little bit differently than I normally would. And so I wanted to kind of talk through what I ended up making last month and how this has developed and evolved over the years that I've been using Touch Designer and using this technique with my time-lapse photography. Basically, I like to make time lapses, but when I'm not making normal time lapses, I like to do this technique I call texture caching. Where did that go? Basically, what this entails is loading up all the frames of a time lapse into memory and then using displacement maps in order to scrub through time in a way where you end up with nonlinear time lapse. And this is kind of cool because it evolves forever, and these can be data sculptures that are driven by anything. In this case, it's just noise, but it could be weather patterns or input from sensors or real-time interactive inputs from bodies in motion and silhouettes, these sorts of things. And I think it's a really interesting way to view time-lapse because instead of just looking at it linearly, you end up seeing all of the frames kind of visible at once. This was a time-lapse that I shot at Mars College, my first year there. A number of people in this room were here. I had said at the very beginning of the semester that I wanted to do a 24-hour time-lapse on the beach. And finally, after Mars was over, the few of us that were straggling behind did a little acid trip beach party, and you might see Carell walking into the no-no zone at some point in time. Let's see, where is that?
Oh, there he is.
Yeah.
You see him?
Yeah. He was a ghost.
Yeah, he is a tiny, tiny little man, lost in the desert. But this is a really interesting way to kind of play with time. You kind of have this like time dilation thing that happens, and it's really neat when you do this with a locked-off time-lapse shot. So when I travel, I like to do these time lapses, specifically ones where there is a drastic transition between night and day or day and night. And in order to shoot these, I use something called the Holy Grail time-lapse technique. And this is a technique that's been around for a while, but there's software and there's forums and there's people dedicated to a practice using this specific technique. It's a very manual process. It's kind of meditative for me because basically you're riding only the shutter speed for the entire duration of the transition. Obviously, you could use an automatic mode in order to get your exposure, but that's going to do really undesirable things to your time lapse. And it's going to introduce a lot of flickering because if your camera is manually setting your exposure and your ISO, what's going to end up happening is every time the sun goes behind the clouds or a tree or something like this, it's going to introduce changes in the lighting, and your camera's going to automatically try to expose for the new lighting condition, and it's going to introduce a ton of flickering. And you really don't want that if you want to smooth time lapse. So this often involves waking up really, really early or staying out pretty late and babysitting your camera for 6 hours, 8 hours, 24 hours in order to get this kind of smooth transition. And it's a really risky practice because you could easily fuck something up and you won't know it until you've invested a lot of time into the process. So I wanted to talk about how I do this and then how that evolved into the practice that I employed for the project I did in Bali last week. So let's open up this project here, and I'm going to kind of talk through the project step by step and then rebuild parts of it in order to demonstrate how one might do this themselves, and then talk about how this fits into what I was doing in Bali. So the very first thing that you're going to see when we load up this project is two different tops. In Touch Designer, texture operators are called tops, and that is anything to do with 2D textures. And the secret to this process is texture caching. And to do this, we use the Texture 3D top. And the Texture 3D top, it's going to take just a second for us to cache this. Basically, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to point a movie loader at a folder. In this case, this folder comes from a subset of the time-lapse images that I showed earlier from the barbecue last week in Belize here. Basically, I'm very much limited to my graphic card memory. And unfortunately, this is a laptop and it's not my normal machine, and so I'm going to be more limited than normal. The very first thing that you have to do is kick out an image sequence. So this is a PNG sequence of everything from my final edit, and that's 4,500 images. And I did a little bit of an experiment today, and on this 3080 Ti graphics card and this laptop, I can fit 750 images into 16 gigs of VRAM. So there's a few different ways that one can get these images, and one of the tricks, which is kind of silly and brute forcey, but I don't know of a better way to select all of these images, and you could write a script to do it, but what I end up doing is deciding I'm going to take 1 in 4, 1 in 6, some sort of subset of these images. In this case, I can fit 1 in 6 in the VRAM, and so I'll just grab these images and then do this long game of selecting 1 in 6 images and copying them. And you could probably do this with a simple script, but I didn't. So you just sit here and you wait, you grab all the images this way, and then you copy them. And because I'm skipping 5 out of 6 images, doing it this way means I can get the entire range, in this case 6 hours of my night. But it means that there's also fewer steps in between sequential images, and so it's going to be a little bit choppier. Then there's another subset of images here, and this is 750 images from the very middle. And so this won't be as early in the night or as late in the night, which means it's not quite as dark or quite as bright as I would have wanted it, but it gives me a really smooth result when I do sequential images that are next to each other. For this time lapse, I shot at 6-second intervals most of the night until kicking it up to about 12-second intervals once it was darker. So you'll also see that things move a little bit faster later at night. So this time machine and texture 3D setup works with a little bit of a pre-fill script that I run either at start or manually. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to first turn off real time on my project. If real time is on in Touch Designer, it's going to try to run everything at 60 frames per second. And we don't actually want that in this case, because what we're doing here is then we're going to unbypass this movie player and we're going to pre-fill our texture 3D, then we're going to re-bypass it and then turn real time back off. So you won't see any of those things happen, but essentially all that this is doing is playing through all of the frames in my movie one at a time. If this is actually cooking, you'll see that we're just using me.time.frame, so it's looking at the local time of this operator and scrubbing through the frames. And when I pulse this, it's going to take a few minutes to load up. I should actually probably kill everything else that's going on because we're going to be using basically all but like a gigabyte of my VRAM in order to fill this up. But we're going to get a 3D texture array. And what is a 3D texture array? Well, we can only see it in 2D, and that's how it's going to present it. But basically, we're caching into memory all the images that are here, and then this texture 3D top works in tangent with the time machine top. And what the time machine top does is it accepts a 3D texture array and it accepts a key input, which is a luminance map, so grayscale video. So here we go, we're loaded up, and now we can see by middle clicking here that we have 751 images at 1920 by 1277. The original images are 8K images. I usually do this at 4K if I have the VRAM. But because I'm on a laptop and because I have so many images this night from the fast intervals, I'm running at 1920 and taking the subset of 750 images. And now that we've got all of these loaded up, you can plug this into a time machine top, which I have set up right here. And I'm taking this and offsetting the size of the array that it's looking for by the length of info of what's loaded in here. So this info chop is looking at my texture 3D and telling me that I have 751 loaded into memory. And now...
sorry?
Yep.
What did you do before texture 3D? Like, did you load all the frames and move files sequentially, or how did you get
We loaded all of the images from the image sequence in the folder that I...
So you were loading like one by one really fast?
Yeah, so basically what happens here is because this is going through with me.time.frame, it's just sequentially going through.
And you just have the folder file.
Exactly. So this is looking at the image sequence folder, it's scrubbing through each of the frames with real time off, it's one at a time loading those with prefill, and now we have all our images loaded into memory. And so now that I've done this, anything that I decide to put into this time machine top, driven by grayscale video, is going to be, and I'm just going to grab a pre-made here width and height, and I'm going to set my resolution to the width and height that I want. So let's just pop right in here, and now I can scrub through time with this constant. So if I scrub through here, imagine that every single pixel in this array of 1920 by 1277 has its own time fader. Okay? And that time fader is driven by the white value of the incoming video. So we can take lots of different kinds of shapes. I'll just grab here the same thing. If I grab this ramp and I pop it in, now we have a ramp, and we can play around with the phase, and we see all the pixels in time at once. And this is the folder from the middle segment. right, the middle 750 of the night. If I take the other one, you'll see a much steppier version of this. You see here in the clouds, these sequential things are kind of chunky. Part of that is because I haven't yet changed the pixel format to 32-bit. And this is one place where high bit value of floating points makes a big difference. You see how if I undo that and redo that, oops. So maybe let's find a good chunk here. Oh, I guess this is good. So up here in the corner, you'll see how steppy each of these individual clouds is. And if I change the bit depth here to 16 or to 32, you'll see how it got a lot smoother. All right. So the floating point value really makes a big difference here in terms of getting a smooth video. And once you've done that, now you can drive this by anything. So I kind of prepared just a handful of my go-to tricks for driving these sorts of things. So one of them would just be a constant that's driven by an LFO. In this case, this is the constant, and I'm just pushing the value by a triangle. So a triangle ramp is gonna look like this, right? Here's a sine wave, and if I set this to triangle, you'll just get a straight in and out. And I've divided the frame rate by 120 here. If I set this to 1, then that would be 60 FPS, which is what I'm playing back by. And because we're going up and down, doing 1 divided by 60, and then since it goes back and forth, by 2 again, so 1 over 120 will get me a straight playback of this video forwards and backwards. And if I decide to make this much faster here, let's just do that over here. Alright, so now we're scrubbing in and out really fast. And it's stopping because I'm going into negative values. So I'll have to offset that by 0.5 to change the amplitude to 0.5. And when I do that, I'm going to get a full in and out here. And we don't have a very high range. I think maybe somewhere else I'm limiting this. Let's see what happens if we go to 2. So you can drive this in all kinds of different ways, but this is just a single float. So I'm just scrubbing back and forth through the video.
Where are you getting the depth?
I'm sorry?
Where are you getting the depth?
What do you mean?
The image. It's not just constant, it's going from further points, so in the comp.
We'll get to that in a second. I think I also have this depth blended in right now, which I don't want.
I thought it's just appearing like this because he's going up and down in the frame, but this was actually in the depth.
No, it has depth map somewhere.
No, you're right. We'll get to this depth map in a second. Good call. Let's see. The constant, and that should be being driven by this thing. There we go. So there's lots of ways that you can drive this. Some of my favorites are using noise, and with noise, we're just using either everybody's favorite abs time.seconds, or in this case, because I want it to be variable, I'm using a constant going into a speed shot, and this means that I can change the speed at which this is going to play back. You can do all your normal things with noise, of playing with the period, playing with the harmonics or the exponent in order to make it steppy or not. But I usually like to set it around 0.8 and slow this down so that it's not too crazy. And then you get this kind of cool, trippy lava lamp type effect. And it's scrubbing through all of your frames. And this one doesn't have enough like really black frames in it because I grabbed the chunk from the middle. So I'm going to just go and load the other one. And you'll see it's a bit less smooth, but we have a lot more data. So let's grab 1 and 6 over here. And we'll pre-fill with that and let it load.
You have already a folder for 1 and 6.
Yeah. And I basically started with 1 and 4. I wasn't sure I could do math, but I was lazy and just decided I'd see how many I could
So
fill.
what does it do when it's more than your GPU?
It crashes immediately. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. It's just going to crash right away and tell you that your GPU is full. At least it doesn't make you wait a really long time. So you'll see this one has a lot wider of a gamut between the early times of day and the late times of day. And you'll see that when I'm getting to pure white or pure black values, the frame's just stopping, right? So you can see that pure white values, the cloud's just not doing anything for me. And so what I also like to do is have my constant compositing at the end here also doing this slow up and down. And I'll often use a limit top set to zigzag here so that if my values become greater than 1 or less than 0, it'll just push back into positive space. So it's basically normalizing everything and keeping it all between 0 and 1 so that there's always pixel motion happening. So you can use noise, you can also use ramps, which I already demonstrated, but playing around with a circular ramp or you could do a radial ramp, you could do vertical or horizontal, and you can get really funky with it. Sometimes I'll get really in the weeds of doing crazy feedback loops. You saw some of that with the desert one that started as a circular ramp, but then displacement and feedback in order to create just this grayscale shape that is then pushing and pulling through time. I also thought it would be interesting to see what happens if I were to work with the depth map. And so I demonstrated this 2 weeks ago, but I used Comfy UI in order to run this through a number of different depth preprocessors and chose one that gave me the nicest value. I then upscaled that through Topaz in order to go from 8-bit to 16-bit and have a slightly smoother time. So let me see where that one is. I think I unceremoniously unplugged it earlier. So this is giving me a depth map, and that's going to now kind of scrub through this based on distance, how close or how far away it is. And you see that the driving video, I'm using difference blend mode so that I always have something going on between my positive and negative values. And you can see that these white lines here end up kind of following the contour a little bit of the shape. Unfortunately, it's way too processor hungry to do a real-time depth map. If resources were no object, then you could do basically a semi-real-time depth anything and even have that in the feedback chain.
But why do you need real time for this one? It's static depth.
Most of it is, but not like the trees, for instance, or the clouds. So
like
I
if they're moving a little bit.
Yeah. So I actually ended up going into Photoshop and painting the clouds out because I didn't want that to affect my sky. So to get a clean depth map, I did that. And you'll also see here, there's a little bit of, jitteriness in the foreground as, parts of the brush are kind of blowing around in the wind. And that's not really to be avoided, but theoretically, if you had all the processing power and all the VRAM in the world, you could, in fact, probably not very well in real time, it'd be a little bit slow and chunky, but you could render out a nice version of this where the depth map is updating with every frame and is even in the feedback loop. So as you do these different kinds of manipulations to the video, that could be reflected in the depth map, which would be kind of neat, but
Would be trippy to do it in a grassland.
I'm sorry?
Would be trippy to do it in a grassland.
Yeah. I mean, everywhere I do this, I find new things that are really fascinating. I really wanted to play around with doing this in the one that we did in here. I wish this was a better time lapse. Unfortunately, it was just a little bit too stuttery. But I really liked what happened. This is at at the reservoir.
Billy CC.
Billy CC, and I didn't know going into it that across the way there was just this solid line of streetlights that were going to turn on. But I feel like this would be another really interesting one to play with. Some of the ones that I do, I'll end up just playing around with the shapes that are present in the actual scenery that I'm in. Is this one the one I'm looking for? Yeah. So, you can take chunks of the composition and play around with putting it, make masks, right? Let's see. There's a lot of interesting effects that you can get from kind of rotating around the time of day, and playing around with shadows, playing around with light. And I think time-lapse already does this really interesting thing of helping you perceive in a way that's kind of unnatural to us. We can't really sense time scale in the way that time-lapse allows us to, but by warping that around and playing with shapes and symmetry and patterns that are in the composition already, we get a pretty neat effect. And so this is a practice I've done for a long time now, but I thought that this might actually be applicable to what I was doing in Bali. I'm going to show you a different practice of mine, which is textures. So when I first started, I got my first camera, Sony A7S Mark II, back in 2015. I didn't know what to shoot. I don't like shooting people. I think it's kind of weird. I don't like doing street photography or candids or something felt really non-consensual about that. I don't really like shooting events. I don't really like shooting like, oh, here's a pretty flower. And so I got really into shooting textures. And that always is really kind of funny. I remember the first photography trip I did was in Tokyo, and everybody's taking photos of the sakura, and I'm like looking at rocks and like walls, and
grunge walls.
But I really like the grunge, and I really like the way that nature kind of reclaims real objects. You get some decay. Man builds the wall, and then nature comes along and does its thing with it. And
Another man.
Yeah. So you get all these patterns that you wouldn't get elsewhere. And so I've been doing my thing that I do when I get to a new place and just walk around with the camera and explore and get lost and take some photos. of different textures that I found. And you know, this
And
was.
sorted by color.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you did it yourself by hand, like sort of?
I'm going to get to that in just a moment. So I started collecting all of these, but then one day I kind of had a little bit of an epiphany, which was if I collected enough of these, I might be able to, here, let's actually save and load up this project. So I thought it would be interesting to use my textures to reconstitute real images. And I had this texture library, and I started to sort them. I tried writing scripts to do this. I went through like a half a day of different iterations. I tried K-means cluster sampling and traveling salesman problem, like perceptual sorting. And that helped me out a little bit, but it didn't really get me what I wanted, which was low saturation images, grayscale ones sorted by luminance, and then high saturation images sorted by color along hue. So if you think of this rainbow, you have Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and I kind of wanted them sorted in this way because one day while I was trying to figure out what the fuck my project was going to be while I was in Bali, I had a little bit of an epiphany that, if all of the texture caching stuff that I do is driven by grayscale video between 0 and 1 luminance values, maybe I could pack both grayscale information and hue information into a shader that would allow me to reconstitute images in this way. So I vibe coded up a script with the help of my buddy Claude, and basically wrote a shader that decides is this pixel a high saturation or a low saturation pixel. And I have a variable for threshold on this. I was basically saying that if the difference was less than like 0.2 between red, green, and blue values, then it's a low saturation image. If it's greater than that, it's a high saturation image. And so this shader that I wrote is here with this GLSL top, and basically, when I say I wrote it, I mean Claude wrote it. I didn't write a line of this, but basically, I'm packing low saturation pixels between 0 and 0.5 and high saturation pixels sorted by Roy G. Biv in 0.5 to 1. And so the output of that allows me to do this thing, where this is my input and this is my output. Basically pulling from my texture library and remapping color pixels this way. Some of the videos that I was making from this, I can just show you, this is the project. I basically took a lot of images, which you'll see in the upper right here, of just photography from while I was out and about. Actually, Ben shot some of these images too during his trip. But some of the bugs and some of the scenery, and I'm basically trying to pack that. Right, where's the surrounds? Let's see. Oh, I know. I'll just go to.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't look like just a Bali trip anymore.
Well, we're not allowed to do any drugs in Bali, so I had to make my own. So this was an interesting experiment to see if I could reconstitute photography with colors from my texture library. And I got kind of close, but realized that I was only using a subset of about 100 images, and it was a little bit too messy. It doesn't quite look the way I wanted it to. This is 100% wet. And it's interesting, but it didn't have any movement. Actually, it's 100% wet if I turn this all the way off here. So you can see that some of the colors are approximating it, and I can kind of dial in the threshold a little bit in order to find, you know, between high saturation and low saturation. But I wasn't very scientific in the way I'd split the number of images in my rainbow, and I would need, it turns out, a whole lot more textures in the library for that to actually do the thing that I had imagined. By blending the original image back in on top with kind of a screen blend mode and playing around with a few different layers of compositing, I ended up getting results that were satisfying but still not moving. And so I used an LFO to start scrubbing through these things. You can go really fast or really slow, but you end up with a kind of interesting way of representing photography, but through this almost like GAN-like or, you know, Google Deep Dream kind of aesthetic.
Ayahuasca.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a mushroom trip. And so, yeah, that was this other project, but it's working pretty much the exact same way as the time lapse. I'm basically coming in and I'm caching a number of textures here. I did, for this kind of proof of concept, 50 grayscale images. I sorted them algorithmically to the best that I could, but ended up just kind of manually going through and rearranging them until it got close. Since then, I think I realized the problem that I'm having is the images are just too big for me to do this properly. The right way to do this would be to scale them down really, really small and then blur the fuck out of them and then just grab a single color value from each image and try to sort them that way. So if I ever get around to a V2 or just cracking this back open and revisiting it, I might try to do that because I've always really wanted an algorithm that will allow me to sort through my texture library and, you know, organize them perceptually by their color or their luminance value.
And what do you mean by scaling down?
I mean, taking a 4K or an 8K image and bringing it down to like 64 pixels and then blurring it. And I feel like if I do that, it'll be easier for me to, you know, if you squint your eyes and you look at the swatches here, you can see kind of what color it reads as to you. And that's really all that I want. And because, you know, it's really difficult.
What does script concentrate on?
Well,
Pick a random middle point?
one of the scripts that I played with was doing square chunks in the middle and then applying k-mean clustering to it. So that kind of creates like a gradient of n number of colors from within it. And then it tries to compare all of those color values to each other. And then the other script is from a friend and colleague of mine, Xander from Mars. He wrote this script that I use actually a lot. It just does a traveling salesman perceptual comparison between every image and every other image in a folder, and then renames them based on the closest perceptual similarity. I don't actually know all of what it's comparing, but it's doing
RGB.
Yeah, RGB, but also maybe some feature extraction comparison. I mean, the script itself, I think I talked about it a little bit last time too, because I was using that with the not sure what TBQM does. But it's mostly this LPIPS perceptual comparison and this TSP solver library. And not exactly sure what it does, but it makes my images sorted in an interesting way. So I ran that on these, and it didn't help me too much. I got chunks of images in a row that I kind of wanted next to each other, but it still required a bunch of manual sorting in order to get there. But yeah, what I'm left with is kind of an interesting way to play with these chunks here. And after I did that, I also threw an emboss top on there in order to give it a little bit more of a textured feel. And there's a few different ways that you can blend this or difference it or multiply it. Yeah, just that was a project in Bali, kind of an evolution of this practice that I've done for many years of collecting textures from wherever I travel to, which I use in other situations too. There was one year I wanted to learn Illustrator, and I did some course on making posters, and this is kind of one of the stupidest projects I've ever done, but I decided that every client invoice that I was going to do for a year, I was going to make a poster for the invoice. Which is really funny because like some of these invoices are for like $100. This one I probably spent like 6 hours making this poster.
It's a great poster.
But it was basically like, oh, if I'm going to do commercial work or corporate jobs or something, then I need to make art in order to get paid. It was kind of this like carbon credits for doing bullshit good work. And was just learning Illustrator. I'd never used Illustrator before. But using this textual photography as grunge layers, this is a piece of tuna that I shot in Japan, and this is a wall that I shot in, I think it was Berlin. But all of these posters end up having cut up collaged chunks of street photography of these different textures. Then I got really ambitious and I started making the posters animated.
If it's above 5,000, you can do video.
Yeah, right. But this is another one of the time lapses. This is from the St. Charles Bridge in Prague, and it's using kind of like this smoky, trippy displacement blur feedback. I didn't have a day to night transition here. I got there a little bit too late in the morning, and so there's a little bit of dawn, but it wasn't really enough to have this like really high contrast light differentiation. So I had to do something a little bit different with it. But yeah, that's basically the thing. Does anybody have any questions, comments, side remarks?
I have one actually.
Yeah, what's that?
I like the one point of view to it that you can actually preserve dynamic time in dynamic fashion, like in general, not even to do an effects or something, but to show actual difference and to show to people how the time can be preserved differently. So I thought of the, let's say, VR scene, like a 360 time lapse maybe, which will allow people to dive into this dynamic time preserved like environment.
Yeah.
So, but my question is that possible not just to pre-render it, but to update it in real time? Not just pre-cache it, but let's say, because time is moving while you are watching it also, and you can actually like replace the old frames somehow and then change the scenery.
So like, are you familiar with split scanning?
No, I don't think. But I realize what is this. It's scanning just by name.
And you probably see this like, TikTok trend kind of thing. Yeah, so you can kind of do this in VR. I worked with an artist friend on an installation that was trying to do time catching in a VR headset. It was kind of trippy. It was basically just like a big empty void with a bunch of these spheres,
Yeah.
and the spheres were textured spheres from a 360 camera
I see.
that's in the room that you're in. But they were offset by like 5 seconds, 30 seconds, and 2 minutes. So you can stick your head into this bulb and you see yourself walking into the room
Yeah,
2
that's
minutes
great,
ago.
yeah.
There's fun stuff you can do with it, but the problem is that it's really limited by your VRAM.
Yes.
Yeah, so having like kind of a lot of VRAM
Yeah, you
is,
can do like a stationary setup with powerful PC, for example, and
yeah, I mean, if you've got like workstation cards,
Yeah,
where you
but
can sync.
the only thing is that do you have to like load them in cache and preserve them, or you can replace them?
No, you can update the cache in real time. Let's see, if we go. So this count is one of the really useful ones, but you can see that
Yeah.
if you have the cache just stay active, then you can cache as much as you want. Right? If I make this 100 frames and I've got the VRAM for it, you'll see that it's just going to keep actively.
I was just thinking about different scale, like a day. Let's say you're watching now, but you see like a previous day, or maybe like a morning while you were at uni or something.
That's going to not be a real-time thing, but at that time scale, you can render that. Or you could have a hardware recorder or something else.
But there is no alternative to VRAM cache in this case, right? You can't have it somewhere else.
If you want to be able to scrub on a per pixel level like that, I don't know of one. No.
Oh, anyway.
Cool.
Thanks, Vincent.
That's what I got.